A light breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, and birds were singing their cheerful songs. The streets were fairly busy. Parents with children, young couples, and grandmothers with dogs strolled along the sidewalks. Among all these passers-by walked a man in his 30s and his little son Tom, who had just turned 5. "Dad, are we almost at the park?" Tom asked, bouncing with excitement at each step. The father, holding his hand, smiled, though he looked slightly tired. It was his only day off in the past 2 weeks, and he had decided to spend it with Tom at the amusement park. "Yes, Tom, we'll be there soon," the father replied, holding back a smile at how happy the boy was. "Just a little more patience." Tom loved the amusement park. To him, it was a place where dreams came true, rides, cotton candy, balloons, and, of course, his favorite carousel. His father tried to bring him there as often as possible, despite his busy schedule. Suddenly, the father noticed something ahead on the road, a small kitten covered in sticky black tar, barely moving. Its fur was matted with dirt, and it looked so helpless and pitiful that the man's heart clenched. He paused for a moment, still holding his son's hand. The father quickly realized that such a sight might shock Tom. The boy was very sensitive, and the father knew how much he loved animals. "Tom, look, they're selling balloons over there," said the father, pointing off to the side, hoping to distract his son. "Balloons? Where?" Tom immediately turned his head in the direction his father pointed, while the father hurriedly increased his pace, trying to walk past the kitten without drawing his son's attention to it. They had almost passed the spot where the kitten lay when Tom suddenly stopped. "Dad, look!" he shouted, pulling his small hand out of his father's grasp, and before his father could say anything, he ran back to the roadside. The father sighed, feeling his heart sink. He had tried to avoid this moment, but his intuition told him that Tom would notice the kitten anyway. As he approached, he saw Tom kneeling beside it. The kitten's tiny, dirt-covered paws were helplessly twitching, and its fur was completely matted with black tar. "Dad, look at him," Tom whispered, his eyes filling with tears as he clasped his hands to his chest. "He's in so much pain. We have to help him." Tears slowly streamed down the boy's cheeks, and his small shoulders shook with sobs. The father knew how much his son loved animals, and this sight pierced his heart even more. But he also understood that helping the kitten was probably impossible. The kitten looked as if its suffering was nearing an end. "Tom," the father began, kneeling beside his son. He wanted to explain that sometimes you can't help, that the world is cruel, but how do you say that to a 5-year-old? "No, Dad, please," Tom cried, looking up at his father with pleading eyes. "We can't leave him. He'll die. Please do something." The father remained silent, watching as his son was overcome with tears. He realized that in that moment, nothing was more important to Tom than this little kitten. And though the father was certain the kitten wouldn't survive, it hurt him to see his son's dreams of a fun day at the park collapse right before him. "Tom, sometimes animals—" He paused, struggling to find the words. But before he could finish, Tom wrapped his arms around his legs. "Dad, please don't leave him. Can we take him to the doctor? To a hospital?" The boy begged through his sobs. The father felt a lump form in his throat. He knew that trying to save the kitten was probably futile, but how could he refuse his son, who was willing to give up all his dreams for one small, dirty creature? "All right, Tom," the father said quietly, swallowing hard. "We'll try. We'll do what we can." With that, he carefully lifted the kitten, trying not to touch the sticky tar, and wrapped it in his old jacket that he had with him. Tom stopped crying and watched his father's every move intently, sensing that now the kitten had a chance. "Thank you, Dad," Tom whispered, wiping his tears. His face was still sad, but hope had returned to his eyes. They turned and headed back home, no longer thinking about the park or the rides. They returned home quickly, though the road seemed endless. Tom stayed close to his father, who carried the kitten wrapped in his jacket. The boy watched the tiny creature with a mix of worry and hope, as if only his love could save the poor animal's life. When they entered the house, Tom's mother, Emily, greeted them with a smile, but it quickly faded as she noticed the strange expressions on her husband's and son's faces. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern as she looked up at her husband. "We found a kitten," he began, carefully revealing the bundle. "He's covered in tar. Tom wants to save him." Emily gasped when she saw the poor kitten, matted with sticky black substance. She knew that the chances of the kitten surviving were slim. A mother's heart sank, understanding how much this could hurt Tom if the kitten didn't make it. "Oh my," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "Tom, sweetie, you understand he might not survive, right?" she asked softly, kneeling beside her son. Tom, with tears in his eyes, just shook his head. "Please, Mom. We have to try." Emily glanced at her husband. They both knew how serious this was. Then, quietly, just to her husband, she said, "Maybe we should." "Replace him? Find another one if he doesn't make it?" Her husband shook his head. He knew Tom was watching every move closely and would never believe in such a switch. "That won't work, Emily. He won't leave his side." Emily sighed, knowing there was no choice, and got to work. She brought warm water, some gentle shampoo, and the whole family began the task of cleaning the poor kitten from the tar. The process was long and difficult. The tiny creature barely breathed, and with each movement, Tom grew more impatient, afraid the kitten wouldn't survive. Several hours passed, but they managed to clean most of its fur. The kitten was frail, and its breathing was so weak that each time it paused, Emily and her husband froze in fear, thinking it had stopped breathing for good. "I'll do everything I can," Emily said softly, deciding that she would take care of the kitten. Every hour, she checked on it, feeding it with a small bottle of milk, doing her best to keep the fragile creature alive. Tom didn't leave the kitten's side, even at night. He was willing to sit by it for as long as it took. A week passed. Each day, the kitten seemed weaker, and Emily had almost lost all hope. She was preparing for the worst, but couldn't bring herself to tell Tom. But then, during the second week, a miracle happened. The kitten, who had barely been breathing and hadn't moved, suddenly began to show signs of life. It started drinking the milk eagerly, and soon tried to stand on its thin legs. Tom squealed with joy when he saw his fluffy friend take its first step on its own. "Mom, Dad, look! He's walking! Tom shouted excitedly, his eyes glowing with happiness. Emily and her husband stood to the side, unable to believe their eyes. The kitten, whom they had thought wouldn't survive, was beginning to recover. Each day, it grew stronger. "This is incredible," Emily whispered, hugging her husband. "I didn't believe he could make it." But Tom, his belief saved him. "I didn't expect this either," her husband replied quietly, watching their joyful son. But it seems that this kitten was more than just a pet to him. It was something much more. Tom was over the moon with happiness. He had spent all those weeks by the kitten's side, and now his little furry friend had become his loyal companion. And the parents, with wonder and joy, watched as their son not only found happiness, but also discovered the power to believe in miracles. It had been 5 years since the small, helpless creature, once thought doomed, entered their home. The kitten, once simply called Little One, had grown into a large and dignified ginger cat, who had become a true member of the family. They named him Charles, and he was more than just a pet. He was a true friend and protector. Charles lived side by side with Tom, who was now nearing his 10th birthday. They were inseparable, playing together, sharing every morning and evening. Emily and her husband often marveled at how this cat had become such an important part of their lives, as though he had always been there. But one warm summer night, something changed forever. Around midnight, Emily and her husband were awakened by a piercing, heart-wrenching scream. It was Tom's voice, and their hearts seemed to stop in that moment. Without a second thought, they rushed out of their bedroom and ran toward their son's room. As they opened the door, they feared the worst. Emily was the first to flick on the light, flooding the room with brightness. What they saw made her gasp. In the corner of the room, on the floor, lay a dead snake. It was venomous, with bright green scales, looking menacing even in death. Emily felt a cold terror grip her, realizing that this snake could have killed their son. But what was even more horrifying was that, not far from the snake, lying still, was Charles. "Oh God!" her husband whispered, kneeling beside the cat. Emily collapsed next to him, her hand shaking as she touched Charles's ginger fur. His eyes were closed, his body motionless. "No, Charles," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. They immediately understood what had happened. A venomous snake had somehow found its way into the house and crept into Tom's room. But Charles, sensing the danger, had confronted it. In defending Tom, he attacked the snake and, in doing so, gave his life to save the boy. Tom, trembling with fear and tears, sat on his bed. He realized that his faithful friend had sacrificed himself for him. There was no joy in his eyes, only pain and confusion. "Dad." "Charles." "He saved me," Tom whispered, tears rolling down his cheeks. Emily and her husband couldn't hold back their own tears. Charles wasn't just a cat. He was a true hero. The next day, the family buried Charles in the backyard, under the old oak tree where he loved to spend his summer days, basking in the sun. They dug a small grave, placed a wooden cross, and on it they wrote, "Charles, loyal friend and hero." Tom sat by the grave, while Emily and her husband stood a little way off, holding each other. They knew they had lost more than just a pet. They had lost a family member, one who had done the greatest thing for them. He had saved their son's life. Time passed, and the pain of loss began to fade, but Charles remained in their hearts. Every time they flipped through the family photo album, seeing pictures of Charles playing with Tom or quietly sleeping by his feet, their eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of gratitude and love. Charles, the ginger cat they once found covered in tar, had become more than a pet. He had been a true protector, who had proven his loyalty with his last breath.